Hello, welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. The 75th anniversary of the D-Day landings has just passed on the 6th of June, and in the last episode we looked at the American experiences that day at Omaha Beach. The high casualty rate makes those landings well known. What may come as a surprise to many is that the Canadians and British landed more men that day on their beaches, Sword, Juno and Gold, than the Americans. Though, to caveat that, once ashore, the build-up of US men and material was astounding over the coming months. In this episode, we're going to concentrate on the British and Canadian landings on D-Day, and I'm joined by John Sadler. Now, we've talked to John before in episode 26 when we looked at Operation Agreement, a combined operations raid in the deserts of North Africa that included the Long Range Desert Group, the SAS and the Royal Navy. John is also a battlefield guide for the D-Day beaches and the surrounding areas, and has a book out called D-Day, The British Landings. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank all those listeners who support the podcast by becoming a patron, either via Patreon or PayPal. Those small contributions help me to put the show together for the enjoyment of all. To show my appreciation for those who support the show, I do try to deliver a few exclusive extras when I can, and patrons will be emailed a link when they are available. To become a patron of the World War II podcast, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast or www2podcast.com and click on donate. So, John, it's lovely to have you back. Shall we start by looking at the British and Canadian forces amassed in Britain? The build-up is huge in the south of England.
Well, we have to bear in mind that D-Day is probably the greatest, biggest, most complex invasion of all time, obviously because it's such a very strong amphibious element. And the first wave alone will involve 100,000 men. The British, the Americans, and our allies, of course, the Free French, the Free Poles, all of those who took part, have to be massed somewhere at the same time as part of Operation Fortitude, the deception operation. We have to convince the Germans that they're actually massing somewhere else. And of course, you've got Patton's famous Phantom Army in East Anglia, which has these huge camps of rubber aircraft, rubber trucks, etc., designed to fool the Germans. At the same time, not only are we massing troops, we're also building the Mulberry Harbours. We're building these huge constructions, which will be towed across the Channel to form the floating harbours to overcome this obsession the Germans have that the British must strike at a principal deep water harbour. And they never really got the Mulberry thing. The Germans never understood. Their intelligence wasn't good enough, thank God. This is what we would actually do. So it's not just, you've got, yes, a huge concentration of men and materiel and transport and ships, and all of the support personnel, all of the rear echelon, who go with that. All these men have to be fed. They have to be accommodated. They have to have their uniform, their kit. They have to, all their vehicles have to be maintained. It's a titanic undertaking. At the end of the day, Britain is quite a small island, and this is a 1940s infrastructure. It didn't have the motorway. It didn't have the necessary facilities, nothing like the facilities that we have today. So it was a tremendous job of logistics and concentration.
I went to university in Southampton, and something that brought it home to me at the time, I'd never really that greatly considered it, was one of the pubs near the Common in Southampton had wartime pictures. It's obvious when you think about it, but I hadn't really thought of it as a 18, 19-year-old, that it was just rammed, absolutely rammed. It is a massive military camp,
yes.
and there's these
yes.
familiar features, but just row upon row of tents, trucks, armoured cars, and they're all sat there. And something else that you brought out, you mentioned in the book, which hadn't occurred to me, embarkation. With the amounts involved, it takes a long time. So some of these men are bobbing about for a long time, aren't they?
Yes, they are. As you imagine, to get that number of men, all of their equipment, vehicles, supplies, ammunition, medical supplies, foodstuffs, the whole vast array of material which you require to mount a modern military operation, especially on this scale, is vast. And there's no way of getting that stuff onto ships more quickly than they can be loaded in the conventional way. So the men still have to fire up the gangplank. Supplies have to be brought on board by crane. It's a laborious process. And, of course, all the harbours are themselves crammed with shipping. There are 6,000 ships involved in this, in Operation Neptune, this incredible flotilla, this huge armada of ships, the biggest, by far, again, the biggest and most diverse the world has ever seen. So, yes, and a lot of veterans I've spoken to, one of their abiding memories is just how bloody awful it was, how uncomfortable, sitting in these ships, bobbing up and down. This is the Channel, for God's sake. It's not the most comfortable of waters. And they were very cramped, and it was really rather disagreeable.
It's such a huge concentration. How aware were the Germans? Did they never get any recon flights over the south of England that sort of hinted at what was going on?
It seems not. Obviously, the RAF and US AAF had pretty much total domination of the skies. The only thing that went wrong, if you remember, was that unfortunate business off Clacton Sands where the Americans rehearsing for Utah were ambushed, jumped by German E-boats, which actually inflicted more casualties than suffered on the day. And the Germans, even with any agency they might have had in Britain at that time, just didn't seem to get, they didn't see the spot in the military harbours, and they bought into the spin that we were selling them through Operation, a bit like Pujol, we're selling them through Operation Fortitude, which fed into the German obsession that the British must be attempting to take, or the Allies were attempting to take a Deepwater harbour as the first phase of the operation. And therefore the Germans' eyes were very much focused on Calais. We have to bear in mind that the Germans, totally formidable as they were on land, did not have the same level of flair and genius for amphibious warfare. That's very much a British and an American thing. And we were a lot better at it than they were. And certainly our deception was, the deception operation was a very important part of the success of D-Day. And the reality is the Germans really, I'd say they never saw it coming. I mean, they knew Normandy could be a target, but their eyes were still very much fixated on the Pas-de-Calais.
It's probably a stroke of luck and a credit to the RAF that they never got someone over, because one would have thought even if you got anywhere close, you would have been standing out like a sore thumb, this huge armada that's slowly massing in there a few days before. I
mean, the Germans knew that an invasion was going to happen sometime. They didn't just know A, quite when, or B, quite where. And so we did manage to keep them guessing on both of those. And the intelligence deception was so powerful that the Germans, the Abwehr, were still believing Pujol's reports, even when the D-Day invasion was going ahead, that this was just a diversion. That the Normandy was only a diversion, and the main blow would still fall at Pas-de-Calais. And for a while they bought into that.
So if we look at the British and Canadian beaches, the three beaches, Sword, Juno and Gold, what are the defences like on these beaches?
Well, they're pretty formidable. There's no doubt about that. The Germans have a genius, of course, for creating highly formidable lines of defence. And, of course, what they'd done on the British beaches, the Canadian beaches, these were populous seaside destinations before the war, with casinos, buildings, houses. They'd simply turned all of the seafront properties, if you like, into a continuous and massive fortification, or belt of fortifications, studded with strong points, studded with pillboxes, and gun positions. And although Rommel his Atlantic Wall wasn't complete, it was still an enormous obstacle. And therefore, it's fair to say that on all of the beaches, the defence line was very strong.
The American plan seems to be very much more of a full frontal. They hit the beach and it's just get men forward, get men up the beach. And obviously, that gets into trouble. They just can't get the men up and all going. I wonder if the British units... was their plan similar on the same day, or had they come up with something else? Were they all given different objectives? Or
I think it's fair to say that the British had a different philosophy to our American friends. Also, the Americans, certainly with Omaha Beach, had an immensely tough proposition. It was an immensely difficult beach to assault. You just have to go there and look at the ground and the beach itself and the bluffs and the dunes which overlook it and see what a truly formidable proposition this actually was. The British, on the other hand, had spent more time thinking about this. We'd made full use of Hobart's funnies. Now, of course, they were 79th Armoured Division. These were regarded as a bit of a Monty Python job at the time, but the fact was that the funnies did save thousands of Allied lives. Bradley was not that impressed with the funnies. He did take some of the duplex drive tanks, of course, but used them in completely the wrong way. They were launched 6,000 yards out instead of 3,000. They were launched in a heavy sea instead of a flat sea. And I think on Omaha, they lost 29 out of the 30 tanks. They just went straight down at the bottom. And again, there was this gung-ho attitude that you fix bayonets, get off your landing craft, and then just charge. Now, and of course, the Americans had done an awful lot of this in the Pacific theater. Again, running into huge casualties. And Omaha Beach was probably the last place on Earth you wanted to do a gung-ho charge up the beach, because the Germans were so well dug in, their guns were pre-sighted. And, as one sees in Saving Private Ryan and from all the accounts of the chaps who were there, it was a bloodbath. And British planning, I think, I'm embarrassed to say this because I'm British, but I think our planning was better because you had the commando forces attached to the main landing forces on all three British beaches, and their job was to take specific strong points like the casino, etc., to really focus their heavy infantry skills on the specific strong points to allow the infantry to pass through and carry out their further objectives by getting inland as quickly as possible. I think the main failing in terms of the British planning was the idea that we could reach and take Caen in a day. That just didn't work. It's a funny one for historians, given that Montgomery planned the landings on the beaches with such meticulous detail and, again, achieved great success because of it. And yet we thought, okay, well, we'll just take Caen as well on that day. And it's if they thought, well, hang on, mate, it's a fair way from the beach, especially if you're walking from Caen to the beaches. And, there are these significant Hillman and Morrissey, the significant German strong points between you and Caen, and there's a small matter of, 2 panzer divisions up there. So that aspect certainly was not thought out in the same detail as the actual landings themselves had been, with unfortunate consequences.
Well, I think we should probably get to this at the end, but my thought has always sort of been that there was such a fear of being thrown back into the sea that everyone concentrated on just get the men, get them ashore, and the rest will fall into place. And whilst that sort of does happen...
I think you're right. I think, yes.
The next bit is much more difficult than people anticipated because we'd sort of overlooked it.
The other thing which gets overlooked, and again this surprised me, given that we had so much intelligence about the nature of the ground, it wasn't as if, Normandy wasn't the far side of the moon. We knew what Normandy was like, was the bocage. Now, if you go around Normandy today, as one does, there's very little of the original bocage left. It's very seldom you come across this net. The fields have all been enlarged now, of course, for modern agriculture. But when you do, on the odd patch of bocage that survives, when you get in there, and you look at this narrow, tremendously closed-in fields with their high hedges and the strong stone buildings, you think, my goodness, this is an absolute defender's dream. Mm. The Brownies could have held this against a division, probably, with a couple of Panzerfaust. You just think, and this was, fighting the Hitlerjugend, fanatical soldiers on this ground, which is 100% favours the defender, and yet that doesn't seem to be thought of. I think you're right. The emphasis, and I can understand this, is getting the guys onto the beach, consolidating the beach, and then moving on. Yeah, obviously that's the prime job, to get onto the beach, to hold the beach, and then be able to develop the battle. But it's that second phase, if you like, the development of the battle, where I think the planning is clearly defective.
I guess it's the Airborne that goes in first. The first part of is Operation Tonga. So what are their objectives? How are they to aid the landings that are to come?
Well, the Airborne really are to hold what effectively is the left flank of the Allied position. So the British Airborne hold the left flank, the Americans will take the right flank. And they have a number of objectives. Firstly, obviously, to secure Pegasus Bridge, the Orne River crossings. Secondly, to knock out the Merville Battery, which is Fiedken enfilade sword. And also to secure the high ground, the Ranville Heights, and to destroy the bridges across the Dives so the Germans cannot reinforce. They cannot come in ahead. They cannot reinforce from the east. So the idea is they will seal off, if you like, the landing area and take certain key objectives which will vastly facilitate the success of the beach lines. Obviously, any attack upon Caen on the first day is dependent upon the Allies holding the Orne River crossings, Pegasus Bridge. And the same way, if the Germans cannot get their reinforcements across the River Dives, if they cannot control the high ground at Ranville, then clearly they cannot interfere they cannot rush their reinforcements in, they cannot interfere with the build-up on the beaches and the breakout from the beaches. So the airborne element, which of course goes in first, the paratroops are the first, 6th Airborne, the first guys on the ground, without that, then the invasion would be in significant difficulties.
Would it be fair to say, in some respects, the airborne assault is a bit of a shower, but when you look at the results achieved, they're actually very successful?
Yes, I think that's fair to say. obviously airborne operations in the dark are always going to be fraught with difficulties. And there was this great fear that German flak would be so intense that the airborne armada would be shot to pieces. And as inevitably with these sort of operations, without GPS, the guys in some cases obviously are scattered very far from their objectives and their concentration points. The drop for the Merville battery is an absolute shambles, yet the astonishing resilience and heroism and sheer fighting spirit of Otway and his men overcomes all these problems. He's supposed to have 600 men with heavy weapons. He has 150 men, which is about what they stand up in, but he still takes the bloody battery. And the place where it really matters, the Orne River crossings, the gliders land literally bang on the target. An astonishing feat of flying to get these guys precisely where they need to be at precisely the right moment, and that works. But yes, the paratroop job generally, there is a lot of scatter, and it takes the guys a long time to concentrate and get to where they should be, but the bridges on the Dees get blown, the Ranfil Heights are taken and held, and the job gets done.
Certainly in the American beaches, isn't it? There's an opening bombardment and aerial bombardment. I assume this is the same on the British beaches. How effective was that?
The amount of firepower, bomb power, which the Brits and the Americans could deliver was phenomenal. And yet, in reality, the effect which this bombardment had on the defences, it didn't degrade the defences to the extent that was expected. And the reality was the air bombardment, fearsome as it was, and it certainly did do a lot of damage, it didn't do that much damage. It didn't do as much damage as being hoped for, not by any means. I think on all the beaches, it's fair to say, there was no point on the beaches where the aerial bombardment was so fierce that it prevented the defenders from reacting.
Well, I think on Omaha, there's certainly from the aerial, they were worried about hitting their own people, so that it all ends up overshooting. Yeah. Is that the same on the British beaches as well?
To a slightly lesser extent, what the RAF was very good at was destroying infrastructural targets. Railway junctions, bridges, road junctions, supply and communications dumps, which, whilst it may not stop the enemy fighting on the beaches, makes it very difficult for him to continue the fight. So I would say that the real value of the bombing campaign was the damage it did to the enemy infrastructure, and therefore prevents them from bringing up reinforcements and prevents them resupplying their guys. And the aerial attack was so effective that the Germans couldn't move. They couldn't move their troops. They couldn't move their tanks by road or by rail during daylight.
Yes. So,
and that's a big achievement.
Well, it is certainly later in the day. Everyone's familiar with that opening scene of Private Ryan of the landing craft. That's Omaha Beach. Is that the same for the British? Is the British and Canadian experience the same on Sword, Juno and Gold?
It's certainly the fighting on all three beaches is very intense indeed, and at points the British and the Canadians do suffer significant losses getting off the landing craft and getting a foothold on the beach and destroying the German beach defences. There's incredibly intense fighting on all three of the Allied beaches. I think it's fair to say, obviously, the losses on the American side at Omaha are much higher than the British and Canadian losses, which actually were slightly less than had been anticipated. There was still, losses are heavy, and the fighting was incredibly intense on all three beaches. Yes, it was definitely no picnic, not for anybody.
I seem to get, though, that the British and the Canadians maintain momentum. They hit the beat. And how are they maintaining momentum and getting up and inland? It's not, almost doesn't seem quite as big a battle for the beach.
No, I think that's right. I think Omaha Beach obviously was the bloodiest and costliest of all the D-Day beaches, 3,000 American casualties, enormous casualties. And it was a very, very difficult proposition. And I think everything went wrong. It could have gone wrong, did go wrong. And it took the Americans virtually the whole of 6th of June to claw their way up that beach and just to grab a toehold on the beach, never mind a foothold. Whereas certainly the British Canadian beaches, we were more successful. Obviously, the first-day objective for Gold was Bayeux. We didn't quite reach Bayeux, but we took it on D-Day +1. The Canadians advanced significantly. They made the best advances from their beaches. And I think it's fair to say that getting our armour... Remember the British philosophy, Montgomery's philosophy, wasn't that you put infantry ashore to clear the path for the armour. You put the armour ashore to clear a path for the infantry. And of course, we've been very careful to make sure of the sand conditions, or the conditions on the beaches at D-Day, that these would actually bear the weight of tanks. And we had this dreadful experience at Dieppe where the tanks were caught and revving up uselessly on the shingle as sitting ducks for German guns. Montgomery was determined that wouldn't happen. And the use of the funnies all of the various, of Hobart's various tanks, his bridge layers, his bunker busters, his flamethrowers, his flail tanks, all of these did very, very good service. And it was the deployment of armour and specialised armour that I think contributed significantly to the success of the infantry assault on all three of the Allied beaches, of the British beaches, British and Canadian beaches, and which facilitated that move inland, so that by the end of the 6th of June, the Brits and Canadians had achieved, apart from Caen, obviously on the left flank, we didn't take Caen, but there was significant gain on all three beaches.
Did the Funnies land really early on with their, their flail tanks and things clearing beaches? I hadn't quite.
Yes, they were first wave.
So that's another big difference from the Americans. I hadn't quite realised that they'd arrived that early.
Yes, but they were the sharp end. They were the mailed fist. And if you think about it, each of the tanks had a specialist purpose, and therefore taking them together and properly deployed, they could caretake just about any situation. You had the petard, the heavy gun, the mortar effectively, on the front of a tank, which could blow the bejesus out of any bunker. The flamethrower, which could do terrible damage. The flail, of course, which gets you through the minefields. And then the bridging tanks, which get you across the wet gaps. So it was a very well thought out, as bizarre and eccentric and Heath Robinson as the Funnies seem, it was a very effective complement of armoured vehicles, which undoubtedly made a major contribution to the British and Canadian success.
Yeah, and it did. With the success of the D-Days on the British, actually managed to get the British and Canadian beaches actually getting ashore. That also allows them, with cleared paths of mines, to get up the beach as well in support of the infantry.
Yes, and of course you then got the Commandos as well on Gold, who've got to they've got to link up with the paratroops Oxon Bucks who are holding Pegasus Bridge. So again, that's very important that the Commandos are able to move forward as quickly as they can to relieve the powers at the bridgehead, because obviously they're subject, of course, to significant German counterattacks. The Germans realise very quickly how vitally armed bridges are, and having lost them, they are determined to get them back.
And that's the job of Lord Lovett, isn't it? And his pipe-playing Commandos.
Yes, with Bill Millen piping him along. Admirably played by Peter Lawford, I think, if I remember, in the original D-Day movie. Yes, I had a late uncle who served with Lovett in 4th Commando. And, these were very much your sort of swashbuckling Errol Flynn characters, but they were also bloody good soldiers. They knew exactly what they were doing. I think, if I remember right, one of the legends is that Lovett actually apologises to Howard when they reach Pegasus Bridge because he's 2.5 minutes late. Awfully sorry, old chap. It's held up by traffic. And that part of the operation, again, in the teeth of savage opposition, worked very well.
With all this going on, and the focus is on the beach, do the Germans ever attempt to disrupt this fleet in the Channel? I mean,
essentially, the Navy had obviously massive strength in terms of frigates, destroyers. Obviously, you had big battleships which are using their guns to support the guys coming ashore. But the Germans did actually, a small flotilla of E-boats did get amongst the Allied ships, came out of the fog and sank a Norwegian destroyer called the Svena. Now, this is a free Norwegian ship, a Norwegian destroyer, as part of the beach defences or the beach support on Sword, and a German E-boat managed to get 2 torpedoes in this, at least 2 torpedoes, and the ship went down straight away. But that was our only loss. And I think another destroyer hit a mine inshore at one point. But the only significant loss was this one ship, which was a Norwegian ship, a newly commissioned Norwegian warship, the Svena, which went down to an E-boat.
You would have thought, in many respects, their one big chance could have been disrupting that umbilical cord to Britain. But as you say, it's such a vast fleet, no doubt with a huge aerial umbrella. To disrupt that would be difficult.
The fact was the Germans, by 1944, they no longer had the resources to, the Kriegsmarine was not what it had been in 1940, let's say. I mean, always the Kriegsmarine was a formidable instrument of war, and these Germans who sailed their E-boats into the midst of the Arctic were very brave men. There's no question about that. They were just too few.
So how long did it take the British and the Canadians to get off the beaches and start moving inland?
Less time than you think. The battle for the beaches normally were accomplished within a couple of hours on each of the 3 attacking beaches. There was still isolated pockets of resistance, of course. They weren't mopped up until really the casino, I think, at Lyon-sur-Mer, held out until the next day. So there were these isolated pockets, obviously, where the Germans were defending heavily fortified positions, which held out as isolated islands, as it were. But essentially, after the first few hours, the Allies had broken through the crust of the defences and were actually moving men and material off the beaches into Normandy itself.
Now, there's only one man to win a Victoria Cross on that day.
Yep.
That's Stanley Hollis. Tell us about Stanley Hollis and what got him his Victoria Cross. I'm sure that I have a quote, but I tried to find it about Max Hastings saying his commanding officer told him that Hollis felt like he had to win the war single-handed.
Well, Stanley Hollis, he's a pretty tough customer, Stanley. He had a fairly colourful life. He's a publican. He'd been a wagon driver. I think he was the sort of guy who had either done very well in the army or ended up entirely in the glass house. But he did well. He was a veteran, effectively, by 1944. He'd had a lot of experience. He was a very tough customer. Very cool, very calm. And obviously when they came ashore on Gold Beach, they were being pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from German positions. A lot of the officers went down. And Stan took it on himself to attack these German bunkers, covering fire from his guys. He attacked the German position, knocked them out with grenades, and then led his men onto their further objectives. And again, he knocked out several more German positions in the course of the afternoon as his men were advancing under very heavy fire. And Stan Hollis undoubtedly saved the lives of hundreds of his comrades. And also, really, it was one of those points where the success of the operation, vast as it is, just depends on the actions of one man. But one guy, bites the bullet, gets stuck in, and wins the day.
You read these citations, and it is him basically charging machine gun nests on his own.
Yes.
Incredible chap.
It's an astonishing story. And then he went back and did it again in the afternoon, so it wasn't a fluke. And it's astonishing in a way that given the size of the operation and given the level of fighting, there was only the one actual VC on the beaches, and that was his. But certainly well earned.
It did. You mentioned he'd seen a lot of war. He's been, I think, am I right in saying he's evacuated from Dunkirk, North Africa, then he'd done Sicily?
He's done a lot, yeah.
How many of the British contingent were in a similar position?
Well, quite a lot. I mean, there were an awful lot of green troops involved in D-Day, but most battalions had a stiffening of chaps who'd seen a fair bit of action. Those who might have been involved in the BEF in 1940 or had seen action in North Africa, 1940-43, because a lot of the 8th Army, a lot of the veteran British troops were tied up on the Italian peninsula at this stage, fighting their way through Italy. And of course we had Slim's army out in Burma. There was an awful lot of green troops, raw troops involved in D-Day and in the battle for Normandy, but also there was a fair stiffening of veterans. The DLI brigade, 151 Brigade, 6th, 8th and 9th Battalions, DLI, were chaps who, most of them, have seen previous action.
There is a story, I don't know if they're apocryphal or not, about chaps thinking that they've done enough for the war and it must be somebody else's turn.
Well, yes, you can understand that. If you'd fought for 3 years in North Africa, maybe fought in Sicily as well, you might think, maybe somebody else could do something, just give us a hand. You can understand that. One has to accept that however brave you are, however determined, however motivated, your courage, your resilience are finite commodities. It's like a bank account. At some point, you spend, and then bang, you're in overdraft, and it doesn't work. Your card is declined. Your card is declined, as it were. And that's the way for morale, for heroism. And none of us, our generation's fortunate. We've never, apart from the few of us who were served, we've never experienced anything like this. Even those, and I'm not denigrating anybody who served in the Falklands or any other campaign, the post-war campaigns have not been on that same level of intensity as was the case in the Second World War. Those young men, our fathers, grandfathers, they went through things we can't even begin to imagine. And they kept on doing it. Some people cracked that was the way it is. Again, I think your resources are finite, and you never know when they're going to crack. One of my best friend's father was was a tank officer. And he said that often with the tankies, the guy would be sitting up brewing a cup of tea and he would just lose it. He would just go. He would just completely freak out. And that's because they knew you had a limited period of time in which you could stand that type of warfare. And at some point it ran out. And that's it. You were useless. Nobody's fault. It was just the way it was. It wasn't cowardice. It was a spiritual and emotional exhaustion.
I think it's Lord Moran, is it, that's Churchill's doctor that writes about a well of courage. Once it's gone, once it's empty.
Yes, that's right.
That's it.
That's it. Yep. Once you've emptied it, you've emptied it. That's it. It's gone. You don't get it back.
The problem with most of these chaps, I often thought, is the problem is you're there to the end, but when's the end?
We can look back and say, well, the war ended in 1945. But, if you're coming ashore on the 6th of June 1944, you've no idea when it's going to end. You've no idea whether the operation will be successful. I mean, even at that point, June 1944, to the average British Tommy, or American GI, there's no real sign that the Germans are beaten. They might be losing, but they're not beaten.
Yeah, we've touched upon the Bocage. I wondered if, for many of those who landed in those early waves on Juno, Gold and Sword, if they must have felt quite pleased with themselves once the beaches, they're up and off the beach, only to discover that the beach was the walk in the park in some respects.
Well, that's right. Yes, you're psyched up, and all your training has been directed at taking that beach. And that's been your objective. As you say that, it's the objective to take the beach, to consolidate your position. And suddenly, you're faced with this terrible battle of attrition throughout this very difficult, broken country of Normandy. And, if you're fighting, minute by minute, day by day through this bewildering maze of the Bocage, there's no such thing as an end in sight. You're lucky if you can see 20 yards ahead, and there's good chances of the German behind every hedge with a Panzerfaust. Your armour, all of your superiority in armour, in weapons, in numbers, in air power, is of no account in that kind of fighting. The Bocage, as you say, it's a very rude awakening, because maybe we hadn't anticipated that that's where the direction in which the fighting, inevitably, it's very easy with hindsight, obviously we're going to have to fight our way through the Bocage. There perhaps was a kind of belief that if the Germans were beaten on the beaches, they would simply withdraw.
Well, which is why you might perhaps why you see them carrying push bikes as they come off the landing craft.
Yes, yes.
With the hope that they're just going to cycle across France.
Yes, it's not going to be much of a cycling holiday, actually. Yeah. No, that's right. There is this assumption once you break through the beaches that the Germans will then withdraw, because in some way there's a lot of military logic in withdrawing. If you haven't held the beaches, then retire back to the line of the Somme or any of the major river lines and hold that, rather than just fighting yard by yard, foot by foot. But that's what the Germans did, and the reality is that the Battle of Normandy, right almost till the end, was a close-run thing. Very close-run thing.
We've mentioned the Mulberry Harbours, and I'm sure people are pretty familiar with them. But I thought we'd give a little attention to PLUTO.
Yes, the petrol line under the ocean, yeah.
Do you want to tell us about PLUTO and how important it was?
Remember what I said a little bit before? The Germans were fixated on the idea that the Allies would have to take at least one deep water harbour, otherwise they could never hope to achieve a foothold. The British plan was really twofold in relation to supply, and supply is everything in an operation of this nature. As you say, no fuel, no vehicles when you're not going anywhere. The Mulberry Harbours, which were intended to provide temporary harbours to make up for the lack of a deep water harbour, were part of that. And the other major consideration for a modern industrialised army is fuel. No fuel, no army. And if you think an armoured division on the move, even on on roads or on just bad ground, will use 1,000 gallons an hour of fuel. 1,000 gallons an hour. And the problem actually became more acute, not less, as the Allies advanced. When the Battle for Normandy was finally ended and the Germans were defeated in Falaise Pocket, as the Allies then began to fan out with increasing rapidity across northern France and into Belgium, the supply line became more and more attenuated, because the fuel was still coming in from the Isle of Wight, because at that point we had not taken a deep water harbour. Cherbourg had been taken, but it was so badly degraded by the Germans it would take weeks to get it back into proper operation. Antwerp hadn't been taken, the Scheldt estuary hadn't been cleared at that point, so we were still dependent on bringing supply in onto the Normandy beaches, and the Americans set up this phenomenal one-way system across France called the Red Ball Express, whereby their trucks were taking supplies up to the forward lines. The trouble is, the further you advance, the trucks are actually using up as much fuel as they're carrying to get the bloody stuff to you in the first place. So the supply problem, as always with industrial war, is a major part, and the PLUTO, therefore, like the Mulberry Harbours, like the Red Ball Express, the bits you don't hear about because they're not glamorous. There's no Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks isn't driving a 66 to take fuel up to Patton. Not at all. He's there leading the charge. But the fact is, without PLUTO, there would have been no successful development of the offensive.
I mean, I know it was slightly late coming on stream. I think they had more problems there. Like all these things, they had more problems. No one had ever tried anything so incredible. That's
right. All of this is cutting edge. The Mulberry Harbours, PLUTO. Nobody's done this before. It's a phenomenal exercise in technological innovation and design capacity and production capacity, as well as a military undertaking.
Something else that rarely gets much of a mention when you're talking about D-Day is the French civilians. Presumably they're caught in the crossfire.
Yes, they are. The French resistance, of course, is active. And if you think about it, ironically, some of the worst losses occurred by French civilians take place a very long way from the battlefield. One of the main Allied considerations from the 6th of June is to prevent the arrival of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, from Bayonne. And those tanks, because they can't use the railways, the tanks have to be brought up by road, moving at night. And the French resistance, working with the Jedburgh teams, the British SOE SAS teams, their job is to delay, as far as possible, the movement of these tanks. And they're so successful, it frustrates the hell out of the Germans, so they carry out some savage reprisals against the civilian population, the most notorious of which is Orgeat-sur-Glane, where the whole population, men, women, children, are murdered, down to the last individual. That's a significant atrocity, but there were others as well, not as bad necessarily in terms of numbers, but just as bad. And of course, many civilians, innocent civilians, on or near the beaches, Caen for instance, are killed by Allied bombs. Probably about 10,000 French civilians die in Normandy and afterwards as the price of their liberation. And of course, there are many civilians who have been active in the resistance, though who are all banged up, in those who've been captured are banged up in the jailing camp, and they're all murdered on the afternoon of 6th of June. The Germans kill all their resistance captives. So yes, the civilian population pays a significant price for their liberation, a very significant price.
Obviously, it's the 75th anniversary this year. You're a battlefield guide in Normandy. What are your must-sees for anyone who's never been before?
That's an interesting one. I think just focusing on the British beaches and the British area where the British particularly fought, I think there's a number. Clearly, Pegasus Bridge is an absolute essential. The Café Gondry, the whole story is there, and it's a wonderful museum there as well. Merville Battery again, I think is a must. People have to see the Merville Battery. And then on the beaches themselves, nothing prepares you really like seeing the ground. So of course now you drive along the beaches, and they're back to being a major holiday area. It's quite difficult to imagine what this was like in 1944, when the streets are full of cafes and ice cream parlors and pizzerias, and everybody's playing on the beach, and it's gone back to, why would it not? It's gone back to this very pleasant, very lovely civilian holiday resort, and of course there's plenty of memorials. There's a lot of memorials. I certainly think the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery in Bayeux is worth a look, as is the museum there. Of course, the museum which is just beside the cemetery, that's a very good museum, and the Big D-Day Museum in Caen is also worth a look. That's a very interesting museum. And so one ought just to make that drive along the beaches, just to get an idea as to what it was like. It's quite difficult. And I think probably from the Aramarch, of course, again, is an essential site for the British visitor, because clearly you've got the remains of the Mulberry Harbour are still perfectly, the caissons are still, these are only supposed to last 6 weeks, and they're still there 75 years on. You can see the ring of caissons around the harbour, and it gives you an idea just how big the Mulberry actually was. And if you just move up to Port-en-Bessin, again, which of course was the juncture between the Brits and the Americans, there's some tremendous German Atlantic War defence works at Port-en-Bessin, which, because it's not run by English Heritage and not in Britain, they're not fenced off, there's no hard hats. I've had school parties who've just been running in and out of bunkers, running in and out of trenches, and having a great time, and amazingly, they all seem to survive. So it's a beautiful area, Norm. It's a lovely, lovely place, of course. And at just above our marsh is the L'Historial, which is this wonderful 360-degree cinema where they blend what the place looks like now with what it looked like in 1944. So you're getting a real view of the level of devastation, this total destruction which this coastline suffered in 1944. The battle was, not only was the battle hard fought and bloody, but it resulted in wholesale destruction of most of the towns and villages that were involved. They've all now been rebuilt. Caen was virtually flattened, of course, as part of the battle. So it's important, I think, people get a view that this was no picnic, and that it was no trip to the seaside. This was one of the, in my view, I think it was probably the decisive battle of World War II.
Well, you make this point in the book that with the Allies in I hadn't really thought of it. It's a real crunch point, isn't it? The success of the landing, Cobra breaks out in July 1944. Russians launch
Progression. Operation Progression. Yeah, and
then is the attempt on Hitler's life, and you suddenly think, I hadn't quite appreciated they all happened in such a short period of time.
Yes, and the fact that Fortress Europe, Festung Europa, has been blagged, as it were, that we've broken into Fortress Europe, really means that if El Alamein was the end of the beginning, as Churchill called it, then D-Day is certainly the beginning of the end. There was a lot of hard fighting to go before Germany finally throws in the towel. But the fact is, once the British have won, the Allies, not the Americans, the British, and the Free Post, for all who took part, have won the battle for Normandy, then the writing is very much on the wall for the Third Reich. Hitler's finished.
And I think with that, we should call it a day. Thanks for joining me, John. It's always a pleasure. Loyal listener, if you want to know more about the British experiences on D-Day, the book is D-Day, The British Landings by John Sadler. It's available now. I will put a link, as ever, on the website. Don't forget, for more D-Day information, give the World War II podcast a Facebook like. I'll be posting stuff in support of this episode for the next few days. So that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.